You already know what this parable means. The smallest seed grows into the biggest plant, so have faith. Start small, trust the process. Your tiny beginning will become something great. You've seen it on the coffee mug, the graduation card, the wall of the youth room. Faith like a mustard seed. There's just one problem. That line isn't in this parable. Faith like a mustard seed comes from Matthew 17, a completely different moment where the disciples can't drive out a demon and Jesus tells them that faith the size of a mustard seed could move a mountain. That's a saying about the power of small faith. The parable of the mustard seed is a different teaching in a different chapter, making a different point, and the two have been fused together in our minds for so long that almost nobody reads the parable on its own anymore. But when you do read it on its own, slowly, the way the farmers who first heard it would have, something uncomfortable starts to surface, because there is a serious case that the parable of the mustard seed was never meant as encouragement at all. There's a case that it's a warning. And we've spent 2,000 years quoting the comfortable half and quietly cutting the rest. So let's read it. Matthew 13, verses 31 and 32. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Now, the familiar reading is not wrong, and I want to say that plainly before we complicate it. There is something genuinely true in it. The kingdom of God did begin impossibly small. One carpenter in an occupied backwater, 12 unremarkable men, a movement any reasonable observer would have bet on disappearing inside a generation, and it became the largest movement in the history of the human race. Jesus clearly wants you to feel that shock of scale, the smallest thing becoming the greatest thing. If that is all you ever took from this parable, you would not be empty-handed. But watch what happens when you stop reading it as a poster and start reading it the way a first-century farmer would have. Because there are 4 details in these 2 short verses that would have made the original audience tilt their heads, and every one of them complicates the comfortable version. Here's the first. Mustard was not normally thought of as a majestic tree. Jesus' audience knew mustard intimately. It was common, it was everywhere, and it was not just a tree, it was also a garden herb, a shrub. At its largest, it reached the height of a man, maybe a little more, something you could brush with your hand as you walked past. So when Jesus says this seed grows up and becomes a tree large enough for birds to build nests in its branches, he is not just describing healthy, expected growth. He is describing the opposite. He is describing overgrowth, a plant that is swollen past its own nature into something it was never designed to be. To a farmer, that is not a triumph. A garden herb the size of a tree is not a miracle of blessing. It is a deformity. It is the plant equivalent of something that grew until it became a problem. The very detail we read is inspiring. The people who actually grew the stuff would have read as wrong. Here is the second detail, and this is the one almost no one is taught. Mustard was also a weed. In the ancient world, mustard was not a tidy crop you cultivated in a careful row. It was invasive. It spread. It self-seeded and crept and took over, and once it was in your garden, it was in your garden for good, choking out the plants around it, refusing to stay where you put it. We actually have the records of how seriously they took this. The Mishnah, the collection of Jewish law from that era, in its rules about not mixing different kinds of seed in a single plot, specifically regulated mustard, precisely because it would not respect boundaries. It would jump its row and contaminate the rest of the field. A careful gardener kept mustard out, so listen again to how Jesus frames it. A man took it and sowed it in his field, or in Luke's version, in his garden. To the original ear, that is already a strange, even reckless act. Why would anyone deliberately plant the one thing known for taking over everything? The kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, is like an aggressive, invasive plant that a man let loose where it would spread beyond all control. Now, you could hear that positively. The unstoppable advance of the gospel, refusing to be contained. And maybe that's part of it. But hold it next to the third detail, because the third detail is where the warning truly begins to bite. The birds. Jesus says the tree grows so large that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. And we picture something pastoral and gentle. Little birds, a sheltering tree, a sweet image of refuge. But here is what you cannot forget. This is not the first parable in the chapter. It is not even the first parable in this sermon. Jesus has been telling a string of kingdom parables, one after another, and he opened the entire sequence with the parable of the sower. And in that parable, the birds appear, and Jesus tells us exactly what they mean. Verse 4. Some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. And then he explains it himself in verse 19. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. The birds are used as the evil one. Jesus said it out of his own mouth in the very same chapter, just a few sentences before the mustard seed. So when he now describes a plant that is overgrown into an unnatural tree and says that the birds of the air come and lodge in its branches, the attentive listener cannot unhear what he just told them about the birds. The same creatures that, at the start of the sermon, were devouring the seed and standing for the enemy himself are now nesting comfortably in the branches of the great kingdom tree. They are no longer circling outside. They have moved in. They have built a home inside the structure. And the bigger the branches grow, the more room there is for them to settle. And then there is the fourth detail, and here Jesus reaches back into the Old Testament and pulls a thread his audience would have felt in their bones. Birds of the air nesting in the branches of a great tree is not a random image. It is prophetic shorthand, and it shows up again and again to describe one particular thing, a great empire. In Daniel chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar dreams of an enormous tree that reaches to the sky, visible to the ends of the earth, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches. And Daniel interprets it for him without flinching. The tree is you, O king. The great tree full of birds is Babylon, the proud world empire. And in the dream, that tree is chopped down by the command of heaven, because the king exalted himself. In Ezekiel chapter 31, the prophet uses the exact same picture for Assyria, a towering cedar taller than all the trees, and all the birds of the heavens made their nests in its boughs, and it too is cut down for the same sin of pride. Now, I want to be honest with you because careful study matters here. That tree and birds image does not only ever mean a doomed empire. In Ezekiel chapter 17, just a few chapters earlier, God himself plants a noble cedar and says, "Under it will dwell every kind of bird." And that one is a good image, a picture of God's own kingdom becoming a place of shelter for the nations. So, the symbol cuts both ways. A great tree full of birds can mean God sheltering the world, or it can mean a swollen empire heading for the axe. And that ambiguity is not a weakness in the reading, it is the point. When Jesus reached for this image, he reached for one of the most double-edged symbols in all of Hebrew prophecy, a picture that carries promise and peril in the same branches. He did not pick a safe image. He picked one with a warning built into its roots. And then he made the warning almost impossible to miss, because of the parable he set down right beside it. Read the very next verse, verse 33. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. We treat the leaven the way we treat the mustard seed, a happy little picture of the kingdom quietly spreading until it fills everything. And maybe that is part of it. But you have to ask what leaven means everywhere else in the Bible, because the answer is remarkably consistent. At Passover, God commanded Israel to remove every trace of leaven from their homes, because leaven was the symbol of sin and corruption spreading through the whole. Jesus himself warned the disciples, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And Matthew tells us plainly he meant their teaching, their corrupting doctrine. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Cleanse out the old leaven." He used the identical line again to the Galatians about how a little false teaching corrupts an entire church. Across the whole of Scripture, leaven is the picture of something small and hidden that works silently through everything until none of it is left untouched. And that something is almost always corruption. And look at the details Jesus chose. The woman hid the leaven, concealed it, worked it in out of sight, and not into a small bowl, but into 3 measures of flour, an enormous amount, enough bread to feed 100 people or more. So the picture is corruption's own symbol, hidden, working invisibly until an enormous batch is entirely transformed. 2 parables, back to back, from the same mouth, in the same breath. And in both, there is a strong case that what is spreading is not purely good. Now step back and look at all 4 parables Jesus stacked together in this chapter, because the arrangement is the argument, the sower, where the birds are the evil ones snatching the seed, the wheat and the weeds, where an enemy creeps in at night and sows weeds among the wheat, and they grow up together, tangled until the harvest, the mustard seed, where the plant overgrows and the birds come to nest, the leaven, where corruption's symbol spreads through the dough. One thread runs through every single one of them, and it is a thread the poster version never mentions. The kingdom grows, yes, but something else grows right alongside it, devouring the seed, tangled in the wheat, nesting in the branches, hidden in the flour, allowed to grow side by side with the genuine thing until the very end. And we are not guessing at that, because Jesus interprets the wheat and the weeds for us privately, later in the same chapter. The field, he says, is the world. The good seed is the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, sown by the enemy. And they grow together. God does not yank the weeds out early, because pulling them would tear up the wheat with them, until the harvest at the end of the age, when the angels finally separate the two. That is the world the kingdom grows in. A mixed field, a tree with birds in it, a batch with leaven worked through it, wheat and weeds side by side until the end. That is the warning. Not that the kingdom will fail, it will not, and the final harvest guarantees it. But that bigness is not the same as health, that a movement can swell far beyond its humble nature into an impressive, towering thing, and that the very size of it is exactly what makes room for the birds. The growth and the danger are not 2 separate stories, they are the same plant. And the kingdom did exactly this. It started as a tiny, persecuted, powerless thing, and within a few centuries it had become an empire, with cathedrals and armies and wealth and political power spanning continents. It became the great tree, just as the parable said it would. And anyone honest about the history knows what came to nest in those branches. The faith that began with a Savior washing feet became, in places, a machine of greed and politics and coercion, God's own name used to justify things God had explicitly forbidden. The weeds grew up right beside the wheat, and the bigger the tree got, the more birds it sheltered. The parable did not only predict the kingdom's growth, it predicted the specific danger that arrives the moment a humble seed becomes an impressive structure. And here is where it stops being about ancient empires and becomes about us. Because we are the ones who turned this into a motivational poster, and we did it for a reason. We love bigness. We measure the things of God by size. We count the crowd, the numbers, the platform, the reach, the square footage, the followers. We assume that if something is growing, God must be blessing it. That if it is big, it must be good. That if it went viral, heaven must be behind it. And the mustard seed quietly asks the one question all of that is designed to keep us from asking, what is nesting in your branches? You can grow a ministry, a reputation, a life that looks like a great tree from the outside, broad, busy, impressive, full of activity. And the sheer size of it can be hiding the very thing it was built to resist. The bigger the platform, the more pride can roost on it. The bigger the structure, the more silently the leaven can work. Jesus was never impressed by the tree. He never was. He is watching the birds. So which is it? Encouragement or warning? The honest answer, the answer the text actually supports, is that it is both, and we have kept only the half that flatters us. Yes, the kingdom grows from nothing into everything, and that really is good news, and you are right to be amazed by it. But woven into that very promise is a caution Jesus refused to leave out. Do not confuse the size of the tree with the health of the seed. Do not mistake branches for fruit. Do not assume big means blessed. We cut the parable in half because half of it made a better mug. But do not hear despair in any of this, because the chapter does not end in despair. It ends in a harvest. Remember how the wheat and the weeds resolves. The master does not let the weeds win. He lets them grow for a season, not because he cannot tell them apart, but to protect the wheat. And then, at the end, he sorts every last stalk. The birds in the branches are not the final word. The leaven in the dough is not the end of the story. There is a harvest coming, and the one who sowed the good seed knows exactly which is which, and nothing false will survive that sorting. So the warning is not meant to make you cynical about the kingdom. It is meant to make you discerning within it, to stop you from measuring God's work the way the world measures everything, by size and speed and spectacle, and to send you back to the only things that ever actually mattered: the seed, the soil, the fruit, the wheat hidden among the weeds, the faith that is real, whether or not it is ever large. Because in the end, the mustard seed is not asking you to admire the tree. It is asking you to examine it. It is asking you to look past the impressive branches and the busy activity and the crowd and the leaves, and to ask the quiet, searching question the comfortable version was built to keep you from asking. Not how big has it grown, but what has come to live in it. Not how high are the branches, but what is nesting there. Not does it look like a great tree, but is there still good seed at the root of it? The kingdom will grow. That was never in question. The only question this parable leaves you holding is whether, when it has grown in you, it will be a tree full of fruit or a tree full of birds. Subscribe if this made you read a parable you thought you understood with completely new eyes. Leave a comment. Even one word helps carry this to someone who needs it. And share it with anyone who has been measuring their faith or their church or their life by how big it has gotten, when the only thing that ever mattered was what is growing at the root. May you have the courage to look honestly at your own branches and the grace to tend the seed instead of admiring the tree. God bless you.